Welcome back to 3 Delirium. My name is AJ, and this week we have a bit of a longer video as I'm working through a slight problem. Luckily, I know that the solution can be solved by adjusting my printer's retraction settings, but getting there is kind of a gray area. So stick around to see what I'm talking about. The past few models that I've printed have finished a stringy mess. For a while, I've been noticing a few wispy strings here and there in my prints, but lately the problem has been getting worse and worse. When there are only a few wisps, it's easy to fix them with a heat gun. One quick blast and the strings all shrivel up, but this does leave behind little globs of filament as the string retracts whenever it's shriveled up into a small bead. For the most part, the small beads are easy to remove with a hobby knife, but it would be even better if we could avoid this problem altogether. Let's take a closer look at what's actually happening here. For some perspective, this whole thing is what's called the hot end, the point at which the solid filament is heated up to almost liquid temperatures and then pushed out of the nozzle right here to make then each layer of the 3D print. To do this, these metal parts need to be heated up, which is what this does here. This is the heating element. It heats the metal block behind it, and that metal block surrounds the nozzle, which heats the filament more completely from all sides. Above this, we have the heat sink. This is meant to dissipate the heat, because above the heat sink are plastic parts and other things that don't want to get too hot. All of these little fins on this metal part have a lot of surface area touching the air, so it's really good at transferring the heat from the metal to the air before the heat has a chance to do any damage to the parts above. Quite often, there will also be a fan blowing across these metal blades as well for even greater cooling. The filament is inserted here at the top, and this whole cavity is usually lined with a tube that is made of PTFE, or off-brand Teflon. Just like when cooking, we need a material that's both resistant to heat and is non-stick. The filament is pushed down into this whole piece by the gears in the back, and the heat and pressure force this near liquid plastic out through the nozzle. I've said before that the problem I'm having could be fixed if I adjust the retraction of the printer. What is that? Well, when there's a gap between two places on a model that has nothing in between them, like two towers here, over the fraction of a second, the printer pauses just after finishing on one side before spanning the gap to the other. The gear in the back will then pull a little bit of filament back up into the hot end. This is done to fix exactly this issue. And on my printer, this is the sound that is heard the loudest, the function of pulling it back, the ka-chunk sound as it's moving around. The problem that I'm having, called stringing, happens just like when using a glue gun. There is still a little string of semi-liquid plastic pulling out from the end of the filament that is connected to the print. So even though the printer has indeed retracted, there is still a string connecting the two pieces of the print. I can keep setting the retraction distance or the length that I want the machine to actually pull the filament away from the nozzle, but there is only so far I can go. If the hot filament is pulled too far away from the heating element, it will start to cool down in the heat sink. If it cools too much, then it will need time to heat back up once it's pushed back down into the heat block. But the printer doesn't know this and doesn't compensate for this. So the printer would be moving the entire hot end around as if there was an active hot filament coming out, but the plastic still needs time to warm back up, which would cause gaps and puck marks in the print. Or even worse, it could damage the machine itself due to the increased pressure needing to push hard, pushing on that solidifying plastic. Alright, so we know what could fix the issue. I need to increase the retraction settings for each print. This doesn't really explain though why this suddenly has gotten worse, but let's handle one thing at a time. As I explained, I need to up the retraction, but making sure that it doesn't go too high. Well, I haven't a clue how high too high is, so let's print a few test prints with varying amounts of retraction, and we'll see how much it improves. Our test print is a very simple one. I merely need two towers and a solid base so that it sticks to the build surface. It's pretty easy enough to make, but the tricky part comes when slicing the file. Admittedly, I have never adjusted the retraction settings before on my printer, so I'm not 100% sure where to look to find those settings. But with some educated guessing, it's not too difficult to find. So I can see here that the default settings have the retraction at 3.2 millimeters. That's 3.2 millimeters of filament being pulled away from the nozzle every time that it needs to span a gap. We should probably make a control model though, from which we can compare all the others. So I'll print one at 3.2 and then go up from there. 4.0, 4.5, and 5.0, why not? Then we'll be able to see and compare how they improve on each step. Well, if we look at all four of these, the proof is really in the pudding. Here we have all of the test prints showing less and less stringing by the improved retraction settings. But even with the highest setting, there's still stringing. And there's more than I remember having on my other filament. And this is where I should probably bring up a rather key point. I've recently gotten new filament. Now, I mentioned in a previous video that I've been having difficulty finding some filament. The brand that I would prefer the most, it's called Filamentive, made in the UK, and since I live in an EU country, the import fees and duty taxes since Brexit are way too high. So I love Filamentive filament, but it's far too expensive for me to obtain at the moment. So my second option was from the company that actually makes my printer, Prusa, out of the Czech Republic. They have an extremely good quality filament that they make themselves there in their warehouse. And the Czech Republic is also in the EU, so there's no import duties. But sadly, their filament is naturally on the pricey side, and they don't really have the most numerous of colors. They have quality over quantity. So I found a company in France called Francofil. I rather like their name, and they offered a wide array of colors, and they sell their filament in smaller size reels, meaning that if I need a specific color for a specific project, I don't need an entire kilogram of filament. So I had a theory that I wanted to test. I loaded up the file with the best retraction, that 5.0 millimeter, and I printed two more test prints using the filament from the previous companies, from Prusa and Filamentive. And here we can see what I was worried about. The filaments that I have had previously worked with have far less stringing than the new Francofil. Stringing aside, there's a bad sign when we look at the test print made with the white Prusa filament. It's been a bit tainted by color picked up that was left behind from the red Francofil. I have had white filament in the past and switched colors back and forth left and right, no problem, but I've never seen color bleed into another filament like this before. So both of these issues tell me that perhaps this new filament is not as good of quality as my previous two sources. Joel is another YouTuber with his own channel called 3D Printing Nerd, and he has a video on showing the process of making PLA filament, which is what we have here. He has shown that to make this filament, companies start with an opaque, clear, virgin material, and then they add coloring pigments to that. The more pigment added, the brighter the color, but the poorer quality the filament will be. I'm not trying to knock Francofil. I'm just trying to make myself aware of some steps that I need to take if and when I use this filament again in the future. But I'll be honest, this means I'm not going to buy any filament from Francofil anymore. It's a bit disappointing. What do you think? Have you had filament problems in the past? Do you think I've gone through the correct steps in trying to sort out and find the problem that was actually causing this? Have I stuck my foot in it again though somewhere? But not literally, you know, still. Let me know in the comments down below, and I will provide a link to Joel's video about making filament down in the description. Thank you for joining me here on 3 Delirium this week, where we can all hallucinate about the possibilities of 3D printing, and I will see you next time.